Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear guests as well, today is a very special day because I have the honor to interview two eminent scholars with whom I've also closely collaborated in many projects over the years and who have shaped my thinking very much about history in general, but in particular, of course, also about labor history. Jan Lucassen and Marcel van der Linden. They probably do not need much of an introduction to most people in the audience, but because we are also recording this for future distribution on our website, I will say a few words about the role the two of you have played in shaping the field of global labor history. Jan Lucassen founded the research department at the International Institute of Social History in 1988 and headed this department until the year 2000. Jan was a professor in international and comparative history at the Free University of Amsterdam and is a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Jan published extensively on labor history and the history of migration with a primary focus on Europe and India. And his most recent work is The Story of Work, A New History of Humankind. It is the fruit of a lifelong of research and is an impressive and truly global, if I may say, account of the history of work from its very inception until the present day. It was published in 2021 by Yale University Press and has since been translated into various languages, including Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and Dutch. And this is the Dutch version of the book, which is also very handsomely illustrated, I must say. Marcel van der Linden succeeded Jan as the head of the research department at the International Institute of Social History and held this position until 2014. Am I right, Marcel? Yes? Yeah, Marcel is a professor at the University of Amsterdam, was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Oslo, and has very recently, in fact as recently as the start of this week, been elected a fellow of the British Royal Historical Society. Marcel has also extensively published on labor history across the globe, also in particular the history of the labor movement. And his most recent in 2008 you published the Workers of the World. And a sequel to this volume has come out practically 2 weeks ago. The World Wide Web of Work, A History in the Making. It is also the fruit of a lifelong of research and its 17 essays cover quite a great deal of the vast field of global labor history. Now, before we head to the actual interview, I think a few words are in place about global labor history for the non-insiders in the audience, so to say. And I will keep this brief, but I think that is a good idea to be able to frame the discussions that we will have. Crucial for understanding what global labor history is about is this very tiny brochure written by Jan and Marcel almost 25 years ago, the Prolegomena for a Global Labor History. And it offers a tentative outline for a research agenda which aimed to make labor history more inclusive, to borrow today's terminology. Traditional labor history, as it had existed until then, had always focused very much on the, well, to simplify it a little bit, had focused on the male industrial wage worker in the North Atlantic in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the aim now of global labor history was to broaden this scope and to incorporate all forms of labor relations, all forms of work across the globe and across time as well, going back in time and going to different into different continents. The Prolegomena served as a source of, more than a blueprint, it served as a source of inspiration, I think, for the flourishing research program on global labor history, which followed, which has existed over the last 25 years at the International Institute of Social History, in which Marcel and Jan, obviously as heads of the department, but also as researchers and discussants and people of general avid interest and sharp opinion, played a very a key role in this research program. The focus of the research program was and is labor relations, and they are defined as the social relations under which work is performed, remunerated, and valued. And this already gives you the idea that this incorporates, of course, all forms of work, from household subsistence labor through self-employment, wage labor, entrepreneurial work, to slavery and other forms of unfree labor. The research program over the last 25 years, if I can sort of broadly summarize it, developed along two lines. One of the lines was fact-finding, because if you move away from this focus on the North Atlantic wage labor in modern times, you have to know what existed outside this particular time and place. And this was something that 25 years ago was much less known than it is today. I remember Jan saying once, well, we know that wage labor existed in other times and places than in modern times, but where exactly did it exist and where did it not exist? And most importantly, what were the circumstances under which it comes into being? Similar questions were asked about slavery. The transatlantic slavery, of course, well known to everybody, slavery in antiquity as well. But slavery, it was already known then, existed in many times and places. But what creates the circumstances which lead to slavery instead of wage labor, for example? Now, in order to be able to answer these questions, there was this fact-finding line took the form of gathering basic data about the occurrence of these various labor relations in different places in the world over the last 500 years. For this, a global collaborative for the history of labor relations was established, which gathered these data sets and used a universally applicable taxonomy of labor relations in order to be able to compare properly across continents and across time. Now, both this taxonomy and the data sets that were created using this taxonomy were not ends in themselves. They served as stepping stones towards what's the main step, and that is explaining the circumstances and difference and the evolution and the processes which leads to this occurrence and which explain the occurrence of these various labor relations in the different periods and places concerned. And this qualitative analysis then blossomed in a wide variety and a network of interconnected research projects which have been taking place at the International Institute of Social History over the last 25 years. I think I'll leave it at that for a summary. People who want to know more should continue listening to this interview, should read these two magnificent books here on the screen, and should go to our website, because at the website you can download these data sets about which I've spoken. But you can, of course, also link through to all the research projects which have been carried out on the various forms of labor relations in the world. Especially there are a large number of projects on the history of unfree labor and of slavery. With that, I want to move to the actual interview, to these two wonderful books, to these two distinguished scholars. And I must say that both of these books are really, well, as I said before, they are the fruit of a lifelong of research, and they could only have been if you consider the wealth of detail and the depth of coverage that both these books contain. So this really impressive effort immediately, I think, raises the question of motivation, of the driving force behind this effort of a lifetime for the both of you. And this is indeed where I want to start the interview. Accidentally, both of you went to school, as you recently told me. I hadn't known that for 25 years, but I found out only recently that both of you went to school in the same town in Limburg, Weert, but at different times and at different schools. Jan, you went to the seminary in Weert and were educated there to become a missionary. How did you end up being a labor historian in the end?
Well, first by because that's an interesting link. When you are educated to become eventually a missionary, which for the those of you who are not involved in Catholicism, you can become only at the age of 25. But the church is a very clever institute, so they know that you have to start very early on. And what you have to do first is to have the gymnasium from 12 to 18, but in a very protective surroundings, otherwise you cannot be prepared properly to become a missionary. But the link, you suggested it earlier on, I had not thought so much about it, but there might be a link to writing a book like this and to be interested in a topic like this, because it means that from a very early age you are exposed to, let's say, the non-European world. Of course, with a very particular aim. I won't deny that, and everybody knows what missionaries have to do. But there was, maybe not on a daily, but certainly on a weekly basis, we were fed with stories about, especially Africa, but also South America. Well, then what are the next steps? Well, first you have to leave the seminary, and maybe it's also good to believe your faith. And what is especially good is to study history later on. But at the same time, I've always been very much interested in prehistory also, and at Leiden University where I studied, I've also followed all the courses in prehistory. I've done my excavation practices and so on. So that has always been with me. The interest in labor and in work, well, those were the days, and I'm talking about the 1960s, when at least in Holland, but also beyond, the Wageningen school was very popular, and those were historians who, in a anal way, tried to reconstruct early modern societies. And Jan de Vries especially was very inspirational, and also Sliger van Bad, with whom I've also studied and with whom I've also written an MA thesis. The idea was that by quantification one could reconstruct the basic social economic relations within a society. What was missing, to my mind, was the factor labor. So it was very heavily demographic, and also taxation, so social inequality, those aspects were there, but work was not there. So I wanted to write a PhD on work in the Dutch Republic. And then I thought, well, that's an easy piece. On the one hand, you have the demography. I don't have to do it. Van der Wouden and Sliger van Bad, they have done it already. And you only have to reconstruct the labor markets, and then you combine the two, and there you are. But And then I realized very quickly that there was also something like migration. So it was not like what was very much at least the impression the French gave you, that you have a stable society, in which you have input and output, and there you are. But that is certainly not the case in the Dutch Republic. So I thought there should be a chapter on migration. Okay? Then, studying migration, I thought, oh, but there was also a lot of seasonal migration. So there should be a sub-chapter on seasonal migration. The end of the long story is that my dissertation was only on seasonal migration. But yes, in Western Europe between 1600 and 1900. And that gave me, enhanced my, well, let's say my appetite in work and work processes, and especially also in brick making. Well, we have worked together on it. So that was in fact the knowledge I had and the interest I had when I came to the institute.
Yeah.
And well, having the task to set up a research department, the question was how to do that. And one thing I had observed in the university, and which I did not want, was that you have all kinds of specialists. A does this, B does that, etc., etc. And all in all, you have enough publications to safeguard you from being disbanded. And especially also the mentality of university professors. Well, I don't say anything about your specialty, and you don't say anything about my specialty, and then we are all safe. Yeah? So I thought there should be a common topic. And then for a number of reasons, I've chosen, and eventually also together with Marcel, to make work and labor a central part. And one of the main reasons, and maybe I should stop there because otherwise it's only about me, one of the reasons was that was exactly the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the demise of communism, and the sudden, let's say, unpopularity of work and labor and communism and socialism and anything connected to it. And I thought, and Marcel confirmed me in this, I thought, well, if everybody drops it, then we should adapt it. If only because of our collections, of course, but also for intrinsic reasons. Yeah. And then, well, I started to develop my thoughts, and very soon with Marcel and then with other colleagues. Well, that's the story, I think.
So an initial academic interest, which then continued to take further steps all the time, according to the well, yes, the lacunae that you saw in existing knowledge. That would be the driving force behind your lifelong of work, which in the end ended up in being this.
And then very quickly, and that had to do, of course, with the globalization that took place after 1990, the awareness, and Willem van Schendel was very instrumental in that, the awareness that there is more than Europe, and maybe then the old seminary came back. But I remember, if I may cite one small anecdote, one day, it was the beginning that Willem was here, he said, Jan, have you seen, my words, Willem, have you seen something of the world? I very proudly told him about Australia, Morocco and Turkey. And then I think very quickly he said, but you haven't seen India, have you? Then you haven't seen anything. Anyway, he invited me in the early 1990s to Bangalore, and there my love for India started. And well, that opened the opportunity for me to study primary sources on a non-European part of the world, which is quite essential for doing this type of work.
Yeah. Marcel, same sort of trajectory, or did you have another school? Which school, and how did it influence your choices?
So I went in Weert. It's a small place. It was 25,000-30,000 people when we were there. I went to another school, to the Bisschoppelijk College St. Joseph, so the Episcopal college for named after Holy Joseph. This was a very old school, founded in 1648, I believe, and had for 3 centuries been a boarding school. But just at the time when I came there, it was also externs were allowed and girls were allowed too. So, but it was a very good school, I must say. It was also meant originally to prepare people for priesthood. And I had to go there because there were no non-Catholic schools in Limburg. And although my parents were non-believers and I was a non-believer, there was no option. And at school, I decided that I wanted to become an astrophysicist. So I started studying astronomy, physics, and mathematics in Utrecht. But then, of course, revolution was around the corner in around 1971. So I decided it would be better to first study sociology. Okay. So I gave up the attempt to understand the whole universe and just wanted to understand the whole world. Very modest.
Modest career step.
Yeah. And my interest included, of course, labor history, but was not a central thing for me in the beginning. And only when I got my first job here at the Institute in the early 80s did I become a real labor historian. But behind this is something political. I had just turned 16 when I joined the Pacifist Socialist Party, PSP. And there was a special dispensation necessary given by the party leadership because I was too young, in fact. But since then, I've always remained on the radical left. And my inspiration for doing history is originally a political inspiration.
A scholar with a mission.
Yes, and so my main interest in social history has invariably been to explore the limits and the possibilities of societal change in a democratic socialist tradition. Until today.
Which leads me to the following question, and which I also want to ask to the both of you. These 2 books that we discussed today, these last, well, both of them are indeed, so to say, a crown on what you have done all through your careers. Whom did you write this book for, and where would you want the knowledge in this book to land?
Shall I?
Yeah, Marcel, if you can.
Well, I have no illusions about the immediate impact of this book. A few hundred or a few thousand colleagues will perhaps read it, and some will use it or quote it or whatever, and that will be all. So, but I hope, but you can never be sure, of course, that at a later stage, but it takes years, is my experience with earlier books, at a later stage, a second circle of readers and users will emerge, and that they will be inspired in an indirect way by some of the thoughts and insights, and that can then have some more societal impact. But not immediately. This is something for the longer run.
What is good though is that it is an open access book. So
yes,
in
absolutely.
fact people can download it. Well, they can't get this nice paper copy, you have to pay for that, but in PDF form you can download it,
and that makes it
very democratic.
Made it for me also very attractive to publish it in this new series of the Institute.
I see. Jan, your book, what is your intended audience? I mean, not in a sort of technical way, but well, when you write a book, you maybe have a reader in mind, or you do want to land it somewhere. What you have been writing, and what would be your idea? Yes.
Writing for myself.
You're writing for yourself.
I must be honest. This is really the hunger for this to put this together. But basically, the urge grew in lecturing since 1990, 1991. So always being dissatisfied with what I could offer the students and what was available, and then, well, in the end, you have to do it yourself.
with this result, yes, I see.
And of course, I'm happy now to have a very, very good publisher who does a lot to spread the word. But that's sheer luck that Yale wanted to do it.
And I think, if I'm right, you were even invited by your old school to talk about your book recently.
No, in Weert I was.
In Weert, yes.
I was by the Historical Society.
Oh, not the school, but
the school no longer exists, I think.
No. The school has later on been occupied by guest workers, and that's very good because I devoted quite of some my efforts to for helping guest workers in Leiden especially. So it's good to see that it was also the fate of my seminary. But yes, in Limburg I'm still being recognized as a Limburger, and some even are proud of me writing books.
Big books. We will move on to the next block. I forgot to announce this block. This was about motivation. The next block is on class and capitalism, because an essential difference between your two books is a methodological one, if I may say, if I may call it like that. Jan, in his introduction to the book, explicitly renounces the use of the two concepts of class and capitalism, whereas for Marcel, which also becomes clear immediately from the introduction, these are key structuring elements of the analysis. Now, partly, and Marcel has already alluded to this is of course related to different motivational forces behind your scholarship, and behind the scholarship of you two. But what I'm interested in this block is to see what the consequences are of these two, well, very fundamental choices. What do you gain when you embrace these concepts, and what do you lose when you discard them? And I wanted to ask first to Marcel, can you explain why these two concepts are so crucial in your view? Could you imagine writing labor history without using these two concepts? If not, why?
It is possible because Jan has done it.
Yeah, okay.
But, well, I think, and I explain this also in the book, that capitalism is a useful concept because it has an experiential background. That in the changes in society, let's say from the 17th to the 19th century, made clear to people that more and more was arranged by what they called the cash nexus. So money would come in, interfere, and and there have been and people have then started calling this capitalism at the end of the 19th century, especially when Werner Sombart in fact introduced the notion. Marx only speaks twice in all his work on capitalism, and that is more in private conversation, not he doesn't use the term. So Sombart introduced it, and it became very popular already early in the 20th century, leading to suggesting that more and more was based on money transactions, on commodities. And here begins my definition of capitalism. Capitalism is, for me, is generalized commodity production and circulation. No. That is, that all the inputs in the economy are commodities, and the outputs are also commodities. But I should add that such a generalized commodity production and circulation has never existed in history, because there's always a part still that is not commodified, especially the subsistence labor in households, parenting, caring. That's also why it's this picture of the mother with the child on the cover. Household labor, so parental labor, care labor, etc. Those are to large extent still not commodified, and I'm happy it is not all commodified. But so that means that capitalism is more a process for me than a situation. It's not there is no pure capitalism. There's always impure capitalism, and so that's is an economic process more.
But is capitalism and class as an associated concept, are these timeless concepts, or are they, in your view, well, you said the word capitalism only was coined by Sombart. That does not necessarily mean, of course, that it didn't exist before the term existed. But are these concepts linked to a particular time and place, in your view, or is it something that is applicable or usable throughout time?
I think it is a trans-historical concept. You can use it through history to check whether there is a process called capitalism going on. And this, for instance, possible that in the Roman Empire, certain segments were fully or largely commodified. And in that sense, I could then allow myself to speak of capitalism in the Roman Empire. But I don't know much about the Roman Empire, not as much as Jan. So I'm not sure about that. But in principle, it's possible. And there have, of course, been historians like Rostovtsev and so who have said that there was capitalism in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but they have had a very narrow definition of capitalism, narrower than I have.
So capitalism, widely applicable or a universal concept. Switching to class, the question what I wanted to ask you is. Well, one of the innovations, so to say, that you come with in your book is you coin the concept of the extended working class. The classical working class, let's say, was this male industrial wage labor in the North Atlantic and in industry. But you say, well, we should conceive of class much broader, and indeed, throughout your book, you gather experiences and labor relations and forms of work which you should also, which you argue should also be included into working class, like, for example, slavery. I wanted to ask you, what is to you the most valuable extension, so to say, to this working class? Which are the groups that you would not have included, say, 40 years ago, but now that you do include in your analysis, which you think, well, this is really a fundamental change in the way I look at labor?
I think the most fundamental thing is the inclusion of chattel slaves in the definition of the working class. And that is also what has provoked most of the resistance from historians. But fortunately, more and more now, there are more and more historians who accept this. For instance, Peter Teemin, the American economic historian, quite prominent person, has now also admitted that slaves are just part of commodified labor, let's say, like the wage laborers. But there are, of course, huge differences between slaves and wage laborers. Well, that would be a very different, complicated topic to talk about, but that is worth thinking also about,
Jan, you instead discarded these two concepts in a very explicit way. Could you elaborate a little bit on why you did this, and and maybe what the advantages and disadvantages was? Because of course, well, you start writing and you run into maybe the limits, or indeed it liberates you, the choices you've made. Could you reflect a little bit on that?
Well, in the first place, I don't discard them as such. I hope I've written that I do not use them in this book as analytical categories, because analytically I run into big problems in writing such a long history, because at least to my mind, if you write such a long history as I do, then you have to answer the question, well, if capitalism is a useful characteristic of specific societies, or if the capitalist process, as Marcel just said, is a useful concept, then you also, I think that's part and parcel of being a historian, you have to explain when does it start and eventually where does it end. Mm-hmm. And there I really run into trouble because, well, I've done my best to read the relevant literature. There's also a very nice booklet by Marcel and by Jürgen Koka, which explains all kind of approaches to capitalism, and none of these I could apply, or I could apply nearly all, but then I had to start in early Greek society and by extension also in northern India in the 4th century BC and so on. And then I thought, well, but what does it tell us? Because any characteristic that we use for a society or for societal processes should distinguish from another. Otherwise, it's pointless. Yeah, so capitalism is part of a taxonomy of types of society or of societal developments, if you like. And what are the others and how to distinguish them? I could not solve this. And I thought, second, but there's also a third point which I should not forget. Second, I thought there is a good alternative. If you want to describe work and labor relations as I do, it is very important, not easy, but very important to pinpoint the coming into existence of markets. Markets of commodities, of labor, and that is not easy, but that's doable. Yeah. And this, well, that's a chicken and the egg question, of course, but you might say in a market society, new labor relations are possible. Okay, so being wage labor is possible. And then you have achieved, I think, already a lot. Slavery relationships are much older. They are not linked to markets. They fit very well into market societies under certain circumstances, but it's a phenomenon which is much older and is a side of it. So that then I saw the similarities, and that's what you can also find, I hope, in the introduction of my book, and maybe on several other places. There is a certain similarity in modernism, the use of these terms, and capital of capitalism. It's a way of people now distinguishing ourselves with earlier or somewhere else. And that brings me to the third point. Yes. I think it is there is a certain danger. I'm not talking about Marcel, he has thought very long about it, but I've not done the exercise, but I think if all of us would do the exercise of just analyzing titles of books, and especially articles, and then making statistics of the use of capitalist in titles, it is like a few decades ago, modern and in titles. It is, what does it say us? It might And that's a real danger, I see. It might make us lazy. It suggests an explanation, but as such it does not give it. And sometimes it's a real pleonasm. You can have, well, I invented on the spot, the capitalist history of the Stock Exchange of New York. Yeah, come on. What do we say? But especially, so I'm afraid of this intellectual laziness. And then I think, leave it out, and can you then still tell your story? Stories about, which I emphatically use in my book, exploitation, for instance. Yes. And yes, I think you can. And class, it's the same. Class, as Karl Marx has explained himself very well, it is something which we as scholars we can say a person A, B, and C, they form a class. Yeah? And according to a certain definition, that can be true. But it becomes only meaningful in history if it becomes not only a Klasse an sich, but a Klasse an und für sich. I mean, do A, B, and C identify as one group and act as one group? Yeah? And that is, well, the whole issue of collective action, and which I have addressed also in my book. But then also again, I think, and maybe it's only for the time being, let's for 10, that would be my proposal, let's for 10 years forget about class and capitalism. Can we still explain what we want to explain, yes or no? If not, then burn my books and start again using capitalism. But I hope to have explained why I have not done it, but also why I see a more general risk in using it too easily.
But were you content in the end? I mean, would you have made the same choice again if you knowing you would probably have rewritten the book, but
I'm not content about the book, but about this I'm content.
About this choice. Yes, no, that was my question. Yes. So it was possible, Marcel, or not? To write labor history without class. No, but you in your book you make, of course, you focus mainly on the period as well when capitalism is a process underway, and in that sense an explanatory factor.
Yeah, but I also write little things about Mesopotamia, ancient Rome, and so. Yeah. Because I also see some continuities. For instance, wage labor is, of course, much older than capitalism. It's thousands of years old, and similar things can be said about other labor relations. Yeah.
But it's not so. It's not related to capitalism then. Wage labor.
No.
Essential. No.
No. You see, wage labor is one form of commodification of labor power. Slavery, chattel slavery, not average slavery, but chattel slavery is also a form of commodification of human beings and therefore with their labor power. So you have different forms of commodification, and therefore you have also a wide variety of labor relations that fit under this commodification concept. So also sharecropping, for instance, or indentured labor. I would also include that. And then, of course, another thing is that the people who produce the labor power, this is especially the housewives and so, they should also be included in this class concept, I think.
But so could commodification then be a substitute for capitalism?
Yeah, it's the same for me.
It's for you, it's the
generalized commodity. Production is capitalism.
That was
you did not use commodification as an idea. Would you agree, Jan, or would you differ in opinion with Marcel?
That was the emphasis, Marcel, you put on commodification in your book was quite new to me. I know you very long enough, but the emphasis was new now. And there's also, of course, that's the character of your book. It's more elliptical, so the definitions of capital and so on, they return several places in your book. But there is somewhere in, well, I forgot, let's say around page 30 or so, there you are very explicit about commodification and commodity. And I was asking myself why this concept is so essential to you, because I was thinking, well, what is a commodity? A commodity is commodities are objects which are traded at a market. But then, and as if I remember well, we've discussed that before. Then I think, how can a person be an object? Of course, according to legal rules, you can. You can say, well, like you can put them in the gas chambers. Well, then these are objects. And according to law, you can say, well, the child of a slave, the slave is the property of somebody else, so the child is also property of. But these are, these are legal conventions. But how can we, as historians, put objects, material objects, and persons at the same level under the concept of commodity? I must say that this I can't see that. Why is that so important for you,
Marcel?
Adam Smith, long time ago, he said, well, a commodity has two aspects. One is the value in use, and the other is the value in money. So if we have a commodity like this, it is a value in use because you can drink water. That's the use value. But it's also, now not in this case, but it can be have a money value because you buy it. And the combination of the two creates the commodity. So if you have something which has no use value for anybody, then it's not a commodity because nobody needs it. And if it has no price, it's also not a commodity. So the combination of the two makes a commodity, and you can commodify anything. That's and that is exactly the problem. That if you can commodify everything, then there is a dehumanizing aspect to it. But that's the nature of capitalism.
Yes.
Yeah, but there is also a choice for us scholars to in using and choosing such a terminology. And if I'm not a great philosopher myself, but if we think that human beings are not things, how can we personally accept to describe them as things? Because in a historical situation they are sold.
But that's exactly why I'm this radical socialist, because I think the commodity nature of human beings has to be abolished.
Yeah. If
a scholar with a mission, after all.
Yeah.
Yes.
But well, I have to think a lot of it about it. But
we have been discussing this for
25 years already.
Yeah.
And we unfortunately have to move on because we have to cover tens and thousands of years of history of work, and we have very little minutes left. But so I want to go to the next and last block of this discussion. And global labor history, is it an inclusive labor history? Because that's how I refer to it. And inclusive, I mean the aim. Well, I mean, that's of course is a modern term. 25 years ago, this did not exist really as a concept yet, I think. But I thought it was an appropriate term because it very much epitomizes the drive behind the plea that you made in the Prolegomena to move beyond this very particular focus in labor history to include other experiences of work, which perhaps were even more important, or at least equally important, as industrial wage labor, which, of course, since Karl Marx, etc., had become very center stage in labor history. Now your books, I think, both testify to the fact that this move towards attempt at inclusivity was successful. The scope of research has broadened tremendously. Jan incorporated all of world history, but also indeed with all these various forms of labor, they are dealt with, I think, equally in both of your books. So you have managed, or this has also been a collective effort of the field. You have managed to make this visible, the other forms of labor, but does that make that we have also really incorporated these other experiences, or the other labor relations, these other experiences of work, into our understanding of labor history and the understanding of how labor relations work? Did it alter our perspectives? That's the fundamental question that I want to ask, that I want to deal with in this block. Jan, I want to start with you and focus on, as you already said, a motivational force behind you was, it was then further inspired by Willem, I now understand, to move beyond Europe and see what else there is in the world and what other experiences. And really, it is, it's impressive how much research you have put into uncovering what was going on in different parts of the world throughout human history in terms of labor history and in terms of work. Yet, one of the most, for me, shocking conclusions was actually, after finishing your book, is how little we in the end still know about crucial parts of world history. Some of them were not so surprising, like, for example, we know that pre-Columbian American history, although you have done a great deal to uncover that, but there are great gaps in our knowledge for all sorts of reasons. But, for example, Chinese history I had always assumed to be much better covered than, in the end, after reading your book, it actually turned out to be. And Indian history is even, in that sense, there are even greater gaps in our knowledge. Now, what accounts for this fact? That's a question I want to pose to you. Is this really only because so much more has been invested over decades and decades into building up knowledge about the history of Europe and the West, so to say? Or so is it only differential investment, or are there also other factors at play which make that for some reason European history is easier to uncover or to find out or to do research about?
A few minutes ago I said that partially I'm satisfied about it, partially I'm not, and this is the reason why I'm not. I may say I've really done my best to cover the available literature in languages that I can read, which are only 4, but nevertheless. But then still about big parts of the world, and I would like to mention first Sub-Saharan Africa, let's say before 1850, 1900. It's very hard if you study the topic of work to find something. I think the instrument of the collab has been very helpful to at least systematically try to cover it, but still it's very difficult. There is not much, and but also within Europe, I think that the total number of meters of bookshelf on British social history is roughly equal to the rest of that of Europe. It has to do with national position. It, of course, also very good written sources from for the last 1,000 years, but also the investment in a country. Yes. And so then you can immediately see why there are such big gaps in African history. Well, look at the national product per capita. It's as easy as that, and that explains a lot. No, but it's not only that. There's for China, of course, there's also the political bias. It's terrible to say so, and for Russia, increasingly that's the same.
But India then,
yeah,
I mean, this crucial period.
I'm not sure. There definitely are much less written sources than for Europe, as far as I can judge. But there's also a huge, there is under-usage of sources. Recently, in a book on wages, we have addressed in wages in India between 1500 and 1900, we have addressed that there are there's a vast treasure trove of sources in Gujarati, 17th, 18th century in Modi script, which nobody can read because nobody can read Modi script. And why does and then you have the question, and that's a complaint which I hear from my Indian colleagues. Indian students don't want to learn Persian. They don't want to learn Modi script. And then they come, and there is another theme which I've mentioned already, and then you come to, the easy choices. What do? You take a late part of British imperialism, and then you have the easy whodunit. Everything went wrong, and who has done it? Well, you know it already, the British, of course. I'm not saying that they have not done it, but there's a lot, it becomes very repetitive, like, if I may say so, the history of the Second World War in this country. But so that is, and in India, it might be because social history has also to do with, and I think that's what is common in Marcel and me, basically, why do you want to do social history? Many of us out of compassion. There is an emotional urge to choose this and not all the other fancy topics which we have in history. Yeah, and then I think that the character of the caste society in India really also plays a role. Of course, you have also high caste and high class Indians who, exactly for those reasons, choose for those topics. But generally, there are a lot of complaints about the demise of economic history in India for the last 20, 30 years. Why is that? We are talking about a continent and about I don't know how many students. So this all plays a role. And as I also said, one of the reasons why Marcel and me, we in a very stubborn way, we thought, well, now we stick to labor history if nobody else does it. Yeah. That's also, of course, what you need. But you have fashions and fashions with sociologically deeply rooted fashions which play a role apart from whether the papers are there and have not been eaten away or by the fungus and so on, which also plays a role.
So it's also a mental, there's a mentality, a reason,
certainly, and the science. I mentioned
but
Russia,
scripture
but
thing,
also
Jan. You said, for example, Indian students don't want to learn the languages that they need, for example, to read these old.
That's what
sources.
my colleagues tell me.
Yeah, but would this is this a difference with Europe, an objective difference, or is it? Do you have this? Do you face the same barrier, for example, if you want to occupy yourself with the Middle Ages or the or early modern history in Europe?
Willem could say more about it, I think.
Because with these changes in
but let's say
scripts,
medieval studies in Europe and also in North America are thriving. That's and these all have to learn Latin or Byzantine Greek and so on. You don't need too many people to do these studies. But now, if you see the people who are doing Mughal history on the basis of Persian sources, well, it's a handful. And Gujarati there's a lot of history about Gujarat. Modi comes from there, so I don't have to tell you what kind of history this is. But a serious history based on serious sources, which are lying there in Baroda, for instance. It seems that nobody does it.
No, that seems.
But there's another thing maybe,
Yes,
and
Marcel.
that is the modern language. I mean, if you can read English, then you can also read, let's say, certainly until the 16th century, you can understand texts. And English is the language of the United States and Canada and of parts of Europe, and so thanks to colonialism.
Yes.
So many historians from the Anglo-Saxon background study only English language sources.
No.
And that's also the comparative studies when they started in the 1970s was also England, United States. That was easy. And learning difficult languages from other parts of the world is an extra challenge, of course.
That's true.
Yeah.
But your answers give me hope, because in the end,
there's Google Translate.
Well, if it's under usage of sources, as like you suggest explicitly, and Marcel seems to make the same argument, then that means there is still a lot to be uncovered, and there are no sort of systematic reasons why we will leave with these. Will be left with these large gaps of knowledge on crucial parts of the world.
Cuneiform sources, which are lying there, 10,000 of tablets. Nobody has ever touched them. They've dug up and they are lying in London and wherever. Nobody, not enough people to do it. But no, and also from a technical point of view. But then again, there was the other point. As I said, you have to have an interest in this type of problems. You have to be interested in why are some people rich and others not. Social inequality. Why do some people defend their interests with more success than others? Individual strategies, collective strategies, and so on. Well, you must find that more interesting than the Battle of Balaclava. Yeah, of course.
Well, that seem to be issues which are getting more and more attention worldwide, I think. So let's hope that will change something. Marcel, I'll switch to you for another form of inclusivity of global labor history, and that is what you've also spoken already about, what you refer to as the most valuable extension to the working class, and that's including unfree labor and slavery. There's quite a lot of attention that you devote to this in this book. Well, it's a substantial element of your book and very interesting analysis. Can you say how did including slavery into the working class, or including slavery in labor history, how did this alter your perspective on labor history? Is there an example that you could give
in the book? Of course, is some examples. One example would be the history of labor management. So in the normal textbooks, you learn that modern labor management started in the North Atlantic region, in the United States and in Britain and in Germany, and so and Taylorism, scientific management was crucial in this respect, and so. But if we include slavery in our perspective, then we see that many of the elements of labor management are much older. in the book I also defend the hypothesis that Barbados was the first capitalist country. Very tiny capitalist country, part of the wider British Empire, of course, but that was the first fully capitalist, almost fully capitalist society where almost everything was commodified. The slaves were commodified, the food of the slaves was commodified, the products they made were commodified, and so on. And in this system of very early capitalism, you already see the emergence of new management techniques, especially, for instance, gang labor, so that a lot of people have to do the same moves at the same, and they stand along rows. There's also a picture of that in the book. So move in the same way, synchronized, doing a very limited task, and then maybe later do another one. So some plantations had 2 or 3 gangs, and they had different tasks and so.
Which is similar to the conveyor belt in industry almost.
Absolutely, yes. So, but there was a machine without mechanical parts. And there were books written to describe how you should handle slaves, how managers should handle slaves. And these books were then also, for instance, translated into published again, I must say, in British India, where the books were just republished with the same words. So, for instance, Negroes was just word used there as well, and so. But so that kind of thing, or for instance, the another aspect of scientific management is the timing of how much it does time it costs to do something. How you split up as much of this work as you can think of. And then there are reports of slaves who tell, well, after they were liberated, that their master would entice 2 of the strongest slaves to do the same job at the same time, watch, and then see what, and then they could deduce from that the norm for everybody. Of course, not to say not everybody could work as hard as these top slaves, but still there was this whole idea of Taylorism was 100 years or so older than Taylor himself, and for instance also, but this is then not so much slavery, is this convict labor in Australia, when in 1776 the United States became independent. Britain needed a new outlet for its prisoners, so they then chose New South Wales in Australia. And there was at a certain point there was a governor, Macquarie. There's also a university named after him, and there was a military man. He wanted to have job descriptions. For instance, the police in Sydney consisted of convicts. In the morning they were policemen. In the afternoon they did something else. Yes, because they had also to earn money for paying them the rent and so on. Or the other way around, some did it in the afternoon. So, but he then wrote extensive manuals what kind of work the policemen should do. And how this should be calculated and whatever. And later he made this also for dock workers and for a number of other professional groups. And that was in 1807, I think. So about more than a century before, Gilbreth, an American scholar, designed job descriptions as we use them nowadays, for instance, here in this institute. So many of these things have been invented under unfree conditions. Yeah. And this is not so amazing, in fact, of course, because when you are in when you have totally subdued workers, then you can do much easier experiments than if you have people who can run away. Yeah. That's so. In that sense, I think we can study the history of free labor also better in a different way by focusing also on coerced labor. Yeah. By the way, I think that when we talk about free labor, as Jan of course does in his book, that is also coerced labor. But there is the what we call, we all who, well, I'm now retired, but those of you who still have a wage know that although you can have a pleasure in your work and so, you also have to work because you need money. So there is an economic coercion behind the fact that you are a wage laborer. And in that sense, there's an economic coercion, not a physical coercion, but in that sense, all of us, we are coerced laborers. Except the retired people.
Marcel, you're totally right. But at the same time, what does this tell us? And again, there it's about terminology. To use the same word coerced for, let's say, our physical condition, that we have to work in order to eat, and if we don't eat, otherwise we die. To use for that condition, biological condition, to use the same word coerced as when I, with a gun, I force you to do something. I find I'm not in favor of using that, because it suggests something which is, well, let's say, biologically given, and something which has to do with human relations to be of the same order. And I think it's not.
No, but this is also not what I wanted to say.
But now I say by using the adjective noun coerced for the two, the same noun. I would prefer to use different words for the same for these conditions.
But I did not. I think we have two kinds of coercion here. One is the coercion we all have to work, at least most of us, in order to have something to eat. That's a biological thing, but that is not what I mean. What I mean is that through property rights, people can be directed in a certain kind of a labor relation. So if we would not, let's say, if all the supermarkets would have their food and so on and drinks for free, so there wouldn't be no property rights on the commodities, and so there were no longer commodities in the supermarkets, then a lot of people would no longer work. They just would go to the supermarket and take everything they need, isn't it? So it's the property rights, the protection of the property rights, which coerces people to do wage labor. It's a different thing from that you are coerced to work, otherwise you die. It's different. That is the level of the use value. This is on the property rights.
Which is a perfect bridge to the last question that I want to ask you. If you speak about a labor relation, about property, about people being forced into a specific labor relation, then of course one of the first things that comes to my mind is, and that's one of the things that was very central also to global labor history, is the inclusion of household work, which, as Jan shows very well also in his book, throughout human history is by far the largest labor relation, household work, and it is also par excellence the domain of female labor. So for the larger part of human history, women face almost no choice, but automatically end up in household work. Well, a lot of it has done again to uncover this, but do you think we have managed to make it not only visible, but also to make it like a systematic or structural way of our thinking about labor, this inclusion of household work? And does it pose any problems that we include that in the sense that it's so large, it dominates everything if you systematically include it?
I would include it, certainly.
Yes.
And I would not consider this a problem because, well, as you say, subsistence labor is omnipresent. Perhaps there are a few people in the world who do not have subsistence labor because cleaning the house and cooking the food and so is also commodified. They have personnel to do this, but most people do some care work and cleaning and so on without employment of other people. And of course, as long as households have existed, and that is, let's say, a very long time, there has also, of course, also been household work. This is the ancient Greeks, for instance, had focused, in fact, on the household, as the oikos, as the patriarchal community where you had free people, slaves and servile members and so on. And within that, even in that old oikos, you had a gender division of labor. You can see this very nicely in the Odyssey, where Penelope, so the head woman, let's say, is doing the similar things as the slaves and servants that are also in the household. And that's also why Homerus calls them white-armed. They work inside the house. And the men do mostly work outside the house. So you had already a gender division there, and the women took care of the running of the household. And so that, and I think this should be part of our labor history. Yes. If we that's you I mean, that's what you said. But have we managed to? That was my main question.
We have not.
No. We have certainly not paid enough attention to that. And it's also
which also is probably a matter of sources. Often,
yes,
you must have run into that problem massively. I mean, you identify that it is the overriding labor relation throughout most of the periods that you cover in your book, but still, you were probably you would have wanted to be able to say much more about it, I assume.
Yeah. Well, first, of course, I agree with what Marcel said, but I see there a major challenge for future research. Because if you see this seriously, then now, and I've also sinned in my book to very often to describe it as a kind of unproblematic unit, but of course it's a unit with all power relations inside. Yeah. This has nothing to do with the market, and we call it reciprocal, which it also is, otherwise it would not survive, but it's not by definition a smooth cooperation of all these members, both, let's say, of the elderly and the younger, but also the relation between households. And there in particular, and I've touched upon that topic briefly, we have the situation in which you have the start of new household, where very often, but how often and under what circumstances, the spouse moves to the household of the husband. It has been discussed in the literature, and I think that's a very important insight, that there it matters very much at which age she does so. If she does, well, I've given examples of it, let's say at age of, let's say 10, 11, 12, then of course she brings totally different luggage than when she does it at age 18. And what happens when her husband dies, which, and of course we are talking most of for all these societies at a very high mortality. Does she have the right to go back to the household where she comes from? Does she have the right to remarry? Or is she obliged to stay forever a widow in the household in which she has married into? These are all issues which in the history of the family have been addressed, but maybe I've missed it, but let's say solid worldwide overviews of these different variations and under which they shift and so on. That is something which as far as I know, is missing. What is very striking, of course, is where you have cultural change like conversion. There we have the missionaries again. In Goa, in the 16th century, there a part of the population is being converted from Hinduism, mostly from Hinduism, some also from Islam, to Christianity. What does it imply for this phenomenon? Yeah, and there you see at least that well, it's just some evidence that I've seen that bishops in 16th century Goa, well, apparently have a very hard job in raising this age of these 12-year girls. So, which is against canonic law and so on, but apparently that's how it is being done. So, if we include the household in the story of work, which Marcel has done, which I have done, I think then a lot of work is still ahead of us.
That could be an answer to the last question I wanted to ask to the two of you. If you could mention one topic that research in the next 25 years of global labor history should definitely tackle with top priority, would that then be for you this topic, the household, and how relations fit into that, or something else?
It's a difficult question, but I think there we could make big gains.
Yes.
That I certainly think, especially if we were to apply the methodology which has been developed by Kees and his group in this institute, in particular if we can follow changes through generations. And this not only in Europe and European countries, but also outside of Europe as far as possible. Because then we can test, for instance, to which extent children follow or have to follow, are restrained to follow the occupation of the parents, or to marry to partners in the same occupational group, or choose to move to another occupational group. In some societies it's not allowed to, but it's very well known that it still happens by migration or by changing identity or whatever. So I think if we could combine the new techniques that we have developed for intergenerational and very inclusive intergenerational change, addressing these questions, there certainly we could make gains. I'm not saying that this is the only thing we can. Well,
no, but you're allowed to mention only one thing.
Okay,
so then
for now it's this.
Marcel, what would be your top priority?
The hardest question of all.
Of
your
course,
questions,
but that's
there are so many things that. So what I say now, I may think differently about it tomorrow. But
that's allowed. That's allowed.
I would say surplus populations. So I would say we have to expand the field to non-labor history. Non-labor history is the history of the people who have no work or are underemployed. This is a huge problem, I think, which has grown over the centuries, I think, but this needs to be tested also empirically. But nowadays, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, says that unemployment on a world scale is 5 to 6%. But Gallup, the opinion polling institute, has since 2014 done polls in almost all the world to discover how much unemployment and underemployment there is. And they came to the conclusion that 33% of the world population is unemployed or underemployed. And this largest mass of underemployed and unemployed people is in the global south, of course, but in the north it is also quite large and increasing, although it's not reflected in the official statistics. And it has many implications poverty, of course,
Yes.
but also weak labor movements, lacking trade union power, and so on. So.
And with underemployed, you mean that they do not have enough work
Yes,
to
yes.
make ends
So,
meet?
The Gallup defines full employment as 30 hours per week with one employer. And everybody who has less and would like to work more, that is the
Yes,
part of the opinion
that's,
polling
yeah,
thing, they consider to be underemployed.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think this problem of, and these people are largely not, in a Marxian sense, reserve army, because they will never be employed.
Mm.
And that number of these people is increasing. So I think that would be a crucial point of view to relate it also to the development of labor productivity, for instance, and why is there such an inequality in employment
access
forms?
to work.
Yeah. So that would,
yeah.
at this moment, I would say, would be a very important topic, also politically interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank to the both of you. I will now open up the discussion with people from the audience, and I'm also quite glad that we have three guests in our midst. Erik van Houten from the University of Ghent, Viola Müller from the Bonn Center for the Study of Dependence and Slavery, and Jan Kok from, there he is, Jan Kok from Radboud University, and they have also expertise in different parts of what we've been discussing, so I'm also quite looking forward to hear from them. But who wants to be the first?